Hey, everybody. Well, this past week we had a lot of material to get through and didn't have a lot of time to discuss the various strengths and weaknesses of the different ethical systems. So, let me take a little bit of time to walk you through some of the strengths and weaknesses. I won't explain all of them in depth. Sometimes I'll just mention them, other times I'll illustrate or comment a little bit more. So, let's dive in. As a reminder, I am drawing a fair bit from this book by Steve Wilkins, Beyond Bumper Sticker Ethics. There's lots of places to go to think about ethical systems, but his is very accessible and he provides great illustrations and examples. So it's a good go-to book that I would recommend for you if you want to dig a little bit deeper. So beginning with cultural relativism. Now, probably not a lot of us are going to be attracted to this one because its major worldview assumptions differ from Christianity, and it actually denies some things that are pretty fundamental to Christian faith. Nevertheless, we encounter this view a fair bit in the world, so it's important for us to have some sense of what it contributes to ethical conversations and what some of its weaknesses are. Because after all, we work in the world, we talk with people, and we can find common bridge points and also learn where people are coming from when we disagree. So, a few strengths. One of the strengths of cultural relativism is that it's true that we can be enriched by cultural differences. And if we start out with the idea that only our culture matters and others don't, that's not very good. So, we can be enriched by cultural differences. God made all the nations of the world, He delights in them, and so forth. Number two, we can become aware of our own cultural biases by actually investigating and knowing about other cultures. So sometimes we make assumptions about other cultures being evil when in fact we don't actually understand what their practices might mean. And so at least cultural relativism, because of its extension of tolerance to everybody, might lead us to at least seek to understand before we are critical. And then number three, we can expose myths of our own cultural superiority. This kind of flows out of number two in a way. There are lots of things we just assume in our society today, and sometimes it can be a little bit arrogant. Like we just assume that progress is always good, and so we moderns or postmoderns are like the pinnacle of everything, right? And everybody else who came before us was a primitive or something. And even some of the way people look at places in the world today, they can kind of think that way. Technology, right? The idea that technology is just going to solve all our ethical difficulties. Well, that turns out not to be true. We learned in the 20th century that some of the most technologically advanced nations could perpetrate great, great evil. And then just the idea of the modern world and all that that entails. We make a lot of assumptions that don't necessarily hold true universally. So it's good to be aware of this. Some potential weaknesses of cultural relativism. Again, I say potential because not everybody who holds to this view is going to have all of these weaknesses, and they may hold them to varying degrees. First of all, cultural relativism potentially substitutes culture for God. So, as a Christian, one of the reasons I can't go along with cultural relativism is because it says there's no absolutes, that everything's just as good as everything else, or every culture is as good as every other culture, or whatever. And it doesn't leave room for God to speak into a culture in order to potentially transform that culture. And so it becomes a kind of God in itself, in that it makes culture itself absolute, right? Not accountable to anything beyond itself, except itself. Cultural relativism also carries along with it some problematic worldview ideas that Christians are going to disagree with. Things in terms of our beliefs about theology, right? The nature of God, the nature of human beings, the importance of grace and redemption, like there's no place for divine grace or redemption, those kinds of things. So it leaves out important theological ideas. Number two, the problem of moral consensus on many things. So cultural relativism seems to come about because the assumption is there are so many different cultures in the world that have very different conceptions of what's right and wrong. Like, for example, you might have people in India that don't eat meat, because cows are sacred or something like that. So that's a strong difference, and this points to variability, and that points to the fact that actually there is no ultimate value for cultural relativists. But sometimes, if you dig beneath the surface, though the rules might differ or the practices might differ, actually some of the underlying principles might be held in common. So if you ask, well, why won't this Hindu person eat cows or something like that? Well, that animal might be a reincarnated person. And so it actually goes deeper to the level of a value that we might affirm. Okay, well, if this is a personal kind of being or something like that, then we might agree that we shouldn't kill this being, right? So if you dig a little bit deeper, you can find commonalities. And one of the observations that's often made is, given all the diversity in the world, it's amazing actually how much ethical consensus there is on a whole variety of things. Like the Ten Commandments would stand in many, many cultures throughout the world. Number 3, cultural relativism seems to be self-defeating. It undermines itself, in other words, because it tries to say two things at the same time, but these two things contradict each other. On the one hand, there is no absolute truth, and yet it wants to say that intolerance is absolutely wrong. And so it's making a kind of absolute statement, and yet it's denying absolute truth. So why value culture would be the question, right? Why make that absolute? And then number 4, what motivates change or improvement? Because if all you have is your own culture to go off, well, what begins to motivate your culture to change something about itself if it needs to correct a moral practice? A great example of this is slavery. So if slavery is practiced across a culture, well, then it must be good, because in cultural relativism, whatever fits with the culture is going to be deemed good. But it seems to us that we've come to this place where we kind of all agree that slavery is evil. But what would motivate a nation, let's say today on the other side of the world, that enslaves people to change from that practice? Wilkins writes the following. He says, reasons from inside the culture will not work, because what is currently accepted practice is the obligation of all within the culture. It is right for that group. And there is no reason that can be given to change a practice that is right. Similarly, reasons from outside the culture are unacceptable bases for change, because any attempt to judge from outside is, in the relativist's view, arrogant. No one set of ethics is better than another. So why change the practice of slavery? And this leads into number 5, the pushback that, well, tolerance is not always an absolute good. Like cultures can actually be committed to evil, like Nazism in the Second World War in Germany, or problematic cultural practices, right, that might be followed, like human rights abuses, let's say in China, or practice of female genital mutilation in some countries. Child sacrifice. I talked last week about our trip to the Mayan Riviera and Chichen Itza and the temple there. And there's beautiful things with respect to the Mayan culture, but there's also some pretty chilling things. So a question today would be, if you're a cultural relativist, it doesn't seem like you can consistently advocate that your own government maybe place sanctions on other nations for abusing human rights, for example. Or what about the person who's a Canadian that travels to Thailand and wants to engage in prostitution with young boys or something like that? I mean, these are real things that happen all the time. So the idea that it's okay to do it because you're in that place and they accept it seems to be very problematic. And we actually prosecute Canadians that violate those kinds of laws, even though they're legal in other countries when they travel. Number 2, utilitarianism or consequentialism. So recall, this is the system that is characterized by the motto, do the greatest amount of good or happiness for the greatest amount of people. And it concerns itself not so much with ethical or unethical acts or actions, but rather the results that are entailed by those actions or that result from those actions. So what are some strengths of utilitarianism or consequentialism? First of all, it does kind of make sense to us intuitively when we live amongst other people that ethics should serve not just me as an individual, but rather ethics should also serve the common good, us as a group together. Secondly, and related to the first, the orientation of utilitarianism toward results gives it a kind of pragmatic value, especially in a democratic and pluralistic and multicultural society. So we all live together and we have to get along somehow, even though we're not going to agree on everything, we're not going to share all of the same beliefs or values. So it's kind of a lowest common denominator approach in a way, where we have to agree on what we can agree on and agree to disagree on the things that we can't agree on. And so not everybody's going to be happy, and it's going to require sacrifice, but it's kind of a pragmatic, practical way of moving forward. And it allows us to make collective decisions and to get along without either imposing it coercively, like in a totalitarian system, or by just leaving it all to chance, like in some kind of anarchy. Number three, this approach, utilitarianism or consequentialism, provides a way to balance individual freedom with social obligations. I've already kind of alluded to this, right? So ethics isn't just about me as an individual. It's also about the social good. It's about my rights, yes, but it's also about my duties to others. Now, utilitarianism doesn't speak about duty, but part of what it's affirming is that we're all important and we need to consider the concerns of everybody. So it helps us to balance these things. Freedom with social obligations, equality with constraints around our freedoms. Some potential weaknesses of a utilitarian or consequentialist approach. First of all, and this is a big one, trying to predict the results or the consequences of particular actions is extraordinarily difficult, and perhaps even impossible, because it requires a kind of calculation, and we don't even know what all the variables are necessarily. So how do you know what is going to amount to the greatest outcome for the greatest number of people? Unless you had access to all possible information. And we just don't have that. So there are some common examples used. One is famous foxhole and grenade example. So it's like a battle scene, and someone is in a war kind of scenario. They're standing around, and a grenade is thrown amongst their group. And so the person thinks, okay, I'm a good consequentialist. I'm not going to think of myself only. I'm going to do the greatest good for the greatest number. I'm going to dive on that grenade and take one for the team. Okay. But what happens if that person is carrying a note in their pocket that they've just been given by a senior officer, and they're supposed to deliver it to someone else, and it's got information that might prove decisive in the battle against the other side, right? Oh, that changes things all of a sudden. Maybe this group of 8 doesn't matter now compared to the group of 1,000 of us who are in this battle or something. Okay, and then we can add another detail. Okay, but what if, since the giving and receiving of that note, the situation on the ground has actually changed, and the note is not just irrelevant, but following it would actually be counterproductive and lead to defeat? Okay, well, suddenly now maybe he should dive on the grenade again. And on and on and on it goes. Like, you just notice how as you add layers of detail, what is the ethical thing to do, and what's not just permissible but demanded is changing all the time. So these things can be very difficult to predict. Another example given by Steve Wilkins is, okay, if it's all about predicting outcomes, it becomes hard to even judge whether a particular event was good or evil. So September 11th, right, 9/11, was the act of flying the airplane into the buildings an evil act? Can we say that with confidence? Well, I think most of us would say, yes, it was evil, and I think for good reason. But the problem is, what if there's a detail we don't know? Like, what if there's actually somebody sitting in the plane, unbeknownst to the terrorists, who's carrying with him, the plans to construct and detonate a nuclear bomb in New York City? And so actually, in the long run, it turns out that the plane crash into the building, though tragic, actually is the lesser evil and saves a lot of lives because this physicist has been killed in the airplane, right? It just illustrates that there are all kinds of variables we don't know about and can't predict. And so this can be really problematic. Secondly, utilitarianism or consequentialism lacks attention to other important ethical considerations. So yes, consequences matter. We don't want to rule them out. We do want to weigh pros and cons, even though that's difficult to predict. But other things matter too, like justice matters, and other virtues matter, right? Like things like courage and love. What about intrinsic human dignity? That's got to count for something, right? From a Christian perspective, even from like a Western perspective, the United Nations kind of bases everything off of human dignity. What about motives? Don't motives matter? Or somebody's heart in an issue? Doesn't that kind of matter? It seems that these kinds of things do, but they're not accounted for well in this system. Number 3, what about intrinsically evil acts? Right? So it's doubtful that only outcomes matter. What if some things are just evil and there's no justification for doing them? Like torturing and murdering a 5-year-old child, right? Like how could that ever be justified? It just seems to be intrinsically, inherently evil. And arguably, from a Christian perspective, some of God's laws for us, and there may not be lots of them that are this absolute, but some of them would indicate that some things are intrinsically good and some things are intrinsically evil. And it doesn't matter what they, what they might justify or whatever. They're just bad and they shouldn't be done, no matter what purported good comes out of them, right? So that's an interesting question. A related question is, could utilitarianism or consequentialism be used in such a way that it becomes kind of monstrous, right? So there might be ways of remaining ethical as a consequentialist while committing pretty bad things, right, to individual people. So let's say, I don't know, there's a problem in a company, and you're the president of the company, and you've actually been maybe stealing money or something on the side, and it comes out that the evidence is kind of surfacing, but they can't trace it to you. And now it would be a disaster for for public relations, for advertising, for stakeholders, for the CEO to be brought out like this. And so, maybe the executive team is in on it. And everybody's like, we need to save. I mean, we're employing hundreds of people. We're doing good in the world. We're not going to just die because of this activity of our president. Let's frame somebody else. Let's frame some mid-level manager and plant some evidence. And it's a horrible thing for him, but in terms of the greatest good for the greatest number, it might be justified. So that's a kind of problem that can arise with this. Similar questions come up with the use of torture. Right? Often what justifies the use of torture is the idea that while it may be dehumanizing and monstrous, it might be a lesser evil than the good that could be attained by getting information from somebody through torture, which doesn't always work very well, by the way. But anyway, I think you get the point. Number 4, utilitarianism or consequentialism tends to make morality dependent on the success of an action. So if I'm about to do something good, it's not so much about, am I doing it for the right reason, or am I doing it right, like in order to be admired by others, or because it's the right thing to do. What matters actually is that it leads to the greatest good for the greatest number. So it has to be successful. And this can work against us in a few different ways. So for example, it could lead to a situation where there's just a kind of arrogant or false morality, right? Where I do things for people, not because I value them or care about them, but I do them for ulterior motives, because it's not about them, it's about some greater good. But we want to say, I think, in ethics that actually, if I'm doing something to help an elderly person, then I genuinely care and have their well-being in mind. not just so that maybe I can get money from them in order to, I don't know, raise money for a charity that I'm doing, and so blessing 100 people. There would be a correspondence between our motives and our actions. This can work in the negative too. So there might be an example where, let's say, I give a sum of money to an organization as a charity, and totally unbeknownst to me and totally unbeknownst to the company, let's say they have very good measures in place, good systems, good accountability, good accounting, all that kind of stuff. But even with all of that, the treasurer manages to be stealing money under the table. And so what happens then? My money doesn't get to the place where it's intended to go. Therefore, my actions are not morally praiseworthy because they've been rendered unsuccessful by this immoral treasurer who has used it to, I don't know, go on vacations or buy drugs or whatever. So notice that the outcome actually isn't really fully dependent on me. And so I can't even say my own actions are going to be good or evil in themselves. It depends on what happens down the road and what other people do with them. So that seems to be problematic as well. Number 5, how do we determine what a good or a happy ethical outcome is? So one of the motivations for utilitarianism is that it's just so hard to determine what acts are right or wrong. So we look at outcomes instead. But it seems like we still need some value system or some way of weighing what a good outcome is or a bad outcome is, and where do you get that from? And so it seems to be a little bit circular in that sense. I brought up the issue of vaccination mandates last week, and I think this is a good case to ponder in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of a consequentialist or a utilitarian approach. It also helps you to know, like, let's say that you've got some issues with vaccine mandates. It helps you to know that others that are strongly in favor of them are probably thinking in consequentialist terms. And so that helps you to understand where they're coming from and perhaps maybe how to have a conversation about it. Number 3, Kantian ethics, which is all about doing duty for duty's sake and not making exceptions for yourself, but doing what's universally good for everybody to do. Okay, so do your duty. Gave the illustration last week of pollution, right? So you always think in terms of, if I'm about to do some act, what if everybody were to do this act as a kind of rule? Well, this leads to chaos, right? In the case of throwing, let's say, a bottle on the beach or something. One strength of the Kantian approach, and this is very much Kant's intention, and I think he succeeds quite well in doing it, is that it helps us to avoid relativism, sentimentalism, subjectivism, which is all about, like, what I feel or what I think or my own interior ideas about what should be ethical, and personal preferences as the foundation for ethics. It really tries to get us to think objectively, to think about the moral law, to think about our duty, our obligations, our responsibilities, and to not make special exceptions for ourselves. My goodness, so many ethical problems rise up because people make special exceptions of themselves to the rules, right? And it's so easy to rationalize. So this is helpful in being very strong against that. Number 2, another strength is that a Kantian approach views ethical truths as objective, right? So they're true outside of ourselves, regardless of what I believe about them, regardless of whether or not I like them. Ethical truths just are. They're objective and they are real. Kant believes that there is a moral law. Just as there are laws of physics, and just as there are natural laws in the world, well, there's also a moral law, which points to a moral lawmaker or a moral God. And this is an important insight, that rationality and ethics seem to be united together, and that ethical rationality seems to be built into the nature of the universe. Martin Luther King Jr. expresses something similar with his famous phrase that the universe bends toward justice. Number 3, most people are willing to accept reason as a kind of authority. So they might disagree in terms of what reason requires, or what's actually rational and what's not rational, or what follows and what doesn't follow. But most people are willing to accept the authority of reason. In other words, if you can put things in a publicly universal, accessible way, right, and you're not just quoting the Bible at people or something, but you're putting it in terms of rational principles, that's something that they can engage on and dialogue with. And it helps us to be less defensive and focus on ideas rather than people, that kind of thing. Number 4, the categorical imperative, Kant's summary of the moral law, does bear some resemblance to the golden rule of Jesus, right? So Kant's idea is, don't make an exception of yourself, always only do that thing which you would be willing to make into a universal law. Jesus' version is a little bit different. It's, always do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, they're not exactly the same. There's differences, but there is some similarity there, which is interesting to note. Potential weaknesses of the Kantian approach. First of all, what happens when two or more duties conflict? So famously, Kant thinks about a scenario where a group of violent men are chasing after somebody, and this person, runs into somebody's house and hides. And the men come around the corner, they're looking around, they knock on the person's door, and they say, "Are you harboring this man, hiding him in your basement or whatever?" And Kant says, you have to tell the truth. Because ethics is universal. It's always what you have to do. It's unacceptable to lie. If everybody lied, then that would lead to chaos, because then there would kind of be no such thing as truth. There'd be no distinction between lying and truth. You couldn't trust anybody's promises because everybody lies. That's an absurd situation. It's irrational. Therefore, it's unethical. But this raises some big questions for us. Like, are we really going to refuse to lie in order to give somebody up to murderers? Now, this isn't just hypothetical. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian living during the Second World War, faced this problem because many Germans who had been very influenced by Kant's ethic of duty, you have to do your duty, you have to obey the government, and so forth, that people felt guilty about lying. And Bonhoeffer had to think about this, right? Like, how do we justify the need to lie, right? Bonhoeffer even served as a double agent at one point, where he regularly had to kind of bend the truth in order to, let's say, help Jews escape the country. He was part of an operation that helped Jews escape the country at one point. So Bonhoeffer actually wrote an essay in which he argued that sometimes in order to tell the truth, you have to lie. Now, you can ask me about that maybe some other time. We could talk about that. It's a very intriguing essay and why he thinks this and how he works that out. But it does raise this very interesting question. What happens when two moral duties conflict? The duty to save life over against the duty to tell the truth, for example. And it seems that there's no rational way to resolve that on the basis of reason alone. Number 2, Kant's approach lacks specificity. It tends to be very abstract and big, and these big universal laws don't always seem to be helpful enough in particular situations. They ignore contextual details. And also, when it comes to Christians, it seems that Kant's approach would lead us to disregard some of the teachings of Jesus, especially his teachings that are more particular, more unique, more directed at individuals. So, for example, one time, a rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, what do I need to do to come into the kingdom of God, right, to please God? And Jesus says, well, honor your father and mother, yada, 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 do the commandments. And the guy says, okay, I've done all of this. And Jesus says, one thing you lack, go and sell all of your possessions and then give the proceeds to the poor, and then come and follow me. Now, Jesus doesn't mean this as a universal teaching. He doesn't call all his followers to do that, although maybe to be willing to do that if called upon. But he is calling this man to do that because that's the demand of the Lord to his potential servant. It's a sacrificial call. But Kant would have to write off this command of Jesus from the get-go, because it's not rational. It's not universalizable, right? It wouldn't make sense to require everybody to sell everything that they had, because then we'd all be poor, and resources would get squandered, and that would just be a lousy way to deal with economics. And so Kant says, in that case, this teaching cannot be morally authoritative for us. He says it might be exemplary in some religious sense, but it's not morally or ethically authoritative. Yet, as Christians, I think we'd want to say that if you're that man, you have an absolute responsibility, or an absolute call has been made on your life where you need to respond in obedience to Jesus. Number 3, it is doubtful that reason alone is sufficient for ethics. For ethics from a variety of perspectives, the other systems would see deficiencies in the Kantian approach, but maybe particularly for Christian ethics, there are some things that come out here as well, such as, reason isn't always fully trustworthy. On the one hand, human beings are finite. We don't have access to all the information. We sometimes make logical errors and so forth, and sometimes we can not make any logical errors. We can have a fully valid, in terms of internal validity, perspective, but it might not actually fit the facts of the world. So reason is always going to be partial from a human perspective because we're finite beings, but more than that, we are sinful beings according to Scripture. And so that impacts our rationality as well. The New Testament talks about us having corrupt hearts, but also in places like in Corinthians and in Colossians, Paul talks about us having corrupt minds, that our minds have been corrupt. We've become enemies of God in our minds, he says. And so if that's true, we can't always fully trust reason, at least reason alone, to tell us everything about ethics. Number 4, this is an important question for Christian ethics. Where does love come into the picture for Kant? It doesn't seem to factor in very much. This is a big problem because love is pretty central to New Testament ethics, right? Like, God is love. So if there's no room for love in the system, does that mean there's no room for God in the system? It seems so. At least the particular God who's the God of Christianity, right? Another problem here would be that Jesus commands us to love, right? The biggest commandment actually is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? And the second is like it, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So if we have trouble fitting love into a system, that's going to be problematic. And it's going to mean the system is going to lead us potentially toward legalism in terms of valuing the law more than we actually value the God behind the law or the people that the law is intended to serve and lead to their flourishing.